we're very pleased to introduce Polina de Mauny of Sorbonne Nouvelle University, CERC, with speaking to us about Ivan Turgenev, Marko Vovchok, and Pierre-Jules Hetzel, literary and editorial strategies, followed by собеседник Кирилл Зубков. Polina.
Hello, I'm really happy to be here today. Thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm really happy to present my work, which is already written, and it's a PhD. PhD work I wrote during the 5 last years. And after 2014, I began to seek answers or questions to the contemporary crisis. And this took me back to the middle of the 19th century, where the germs of this crisis are probably more evident. This felt for me like a journey to the past, like in some novels, or following Freud's famous archaeological metaphor of the human being and the city, like an attempt to see the past and the present simultaneously. Freud, in his article Civilization and its Discontents, compares the human being to Rome, in which all eras coexist. And this is the citation. Now let us, by flight of imagination, suppose that Rome is not a human habitation, but a physical, psychical entity with a similarly long and copious past. An entity, that is to say, in which nothing that has once come into existence will have passed away, and all the earlier phases of development continue to exist alongside the latest one. The environment in which the characters of this work exist is like Freud's imaginary city, the world from which nothing disappears, where everything remains, passing from the material state to the imaginary ghostly state and then materializing again. The world which cracks suddenly open, a world upside down. What was hidden comes to the surface, valued are questioned, and new phenomena emerge that require names. So we are in the 19th century Europe, in France and in Russian Empire. To start, I will introduce the structure of my work and the main characters. And then I will speak more precisely about Hetzel published in Smoke, Fumé by Turgenev in Paris, and then I will talk about Marko Vovchok's work with Hetzel and about how Hetzel's interest in the Russian Empire and Ukraine developed. Because of the, sorry, I lost the page with the faces. You can't see it. It's weird. Because of the crisis of democracy in Russia, I wanted to understand how French society found its own way to democracy and to be in a republic. 2 wars make sort of a frame of my work. The Crimean War, which ended Nicholas I's somber reign and opened a period of reforms in Russia, and the Franco-Prussian War of 1970s, which put to the end the Second Empire of Napoleon III. So we have these 2 fields in constant interaction, and the heroes of today's paper contribute to this interaction within the field of cultural production. Sorry, I lost the page with their faces. Well, during this period, which extends from 1841 to 1886, the French field of cultural production developed dynamically, and it was more extensive and more heterogeneous than its Russian equivalent. After 1848, the conditions of the creations of book evolved. Commercial book production and periodicals grew rapidly in line with market demand. Around the year of 1860s, there were 500 periodicals in Paris alone. In Russia, on the other hand, literature and the press were constantly supervised and censored by the authorities. The law of 1836 made it almost impossible made it almost impossible to create a private periodical. Between 1888 and 1855, the period following the February Revolution in France, a period known in Russia as the 7 Dark Years, only 6 new newspapers were founded in Russia. In addition, censorship made literary exchanges between the two countries complicated. However, the Russian public expressed a clear enthusiasm in French literature and knew all the novelties, as evidenced by the libraries, for example, of Alexander Pushkin and those of the characters of his text, like Eugene Onegin, the Queen of Spades. Russian literature, on the contrary, was very little known to the French reader. However, the annulment of the law of 1856 following the Crimean War gave rise to the development of the press. 60 new periodicals appeared between 56 and 64 in St. Petersburg, Moscow, and in the provinces. Also, the technical means were underdeveloped. Rapid news by telegraph did not appear in the newspapers until the 1855. Consequently, the position of the intellectual in Russia differed from that of the intellectual in France. If there was less competition, it remained extremely difficult to have a career as a writer, and the life of an author was steeped in struggles and compromises with power. On the other hand, Russian authors who were in a play of the authorities like Fadei Bulgarian and Nikolai Grech, for example, were able to publish in France and sought to make their career in Paris, the capital of modernity. Creative independence from power was one of the most important things for the heroes of my work. The book market and the publishing industries in France developed rapidly, while the legal system was also gradually evolving in this area. This increased the part that chance and personal relationships played in the success of the editorial project, especially an international project. Editorial laws stabilized over time in Europe throughout a series of conventions. The first one took place in Brussels in 1859, then Paris Convention, very important, 1878, and the last Berne Convention, the convention in Berne, 1886. Despite the economic and political differences between France and Russia, reflection on the role of the author in society developed simultaneously in both countries. This gave rise to the notion of realism in both countries. During this period, France became a republic twice. The Russian Empire moved on from war with Europe and from being an aggressive and retarded country to developing a policy of industrial partnerships with France and a difficult social progress at home. Russia under Alexander II was one of the first to recognize the Third Republic. Well, here. This is a line of steamboats from France via Copenhagen to St. Petersburg, which is somewhere on the top of the map. This is a way to connect two countries, and this is the first libraries at the railway station. Well, Paris as a destination. The characters of this work first came to Paris in their youth. Turgenev and Markovich arrived from Russia, Hetzel from Alsace. Their habitus are not alike, and therefore their strategies and ambitions also differ. All three are equally important to my thesis. Let's talk first about Russian and Ukrainian authors who from childhood speak French. The first part of the work is devoted to Ivan Turgenev, who was the first Russian writer in which the French critics of the time took a keen interest. Turgenev, a native of the province of Oryol, a large landowner, where early became a recognized writer in Russia. In his youth, he was a dandy who studied in the University of Moscow and then Berlin, where he learned philosophy prohibited in Russian universities. At first, he was interested in the idea of social progress of George Hegel, then in the concept of the will developed by Hegel's adversary, Arthur Schopenhauer. He considered himself as a poet, romantic poet, but after he met a French journalist, Louis Verdot, he began to write realistic sketches of life in Russia. His collaboration with Verdot helped him to free his writing from the shackles of servility. This is the article wrote from the Russian text of Turgenev, and the work they made together showed clearly how Turgenev's style changed. The second part of my work is dedicated to Turgenev's literary debut. This is Turgenev and Verdot translations. Second part of my work is dedicated to Turgenev's literary debut, Sportsman Sketches. He launched his literary career with an implicit critique of the system of serfdom. He highlighted the question of individual freedoms, which resonated with the need for political change in the Russian Empire and was part of the discourse of the rights of the human rights in Europe and the United States. The decree to abolish slavery in the French colonies was signed in April 1848 in Paris, and Beecher-Stowe published her anti-slavery novel Uncle's Tom Cabin in 1842. The French publication of Sportsman Sketches was compared by French critics with Beecher-Stowe's novel. Turgenev enjoyed a double success during the Crimean War. He was both a champion of freedom and the highest paid author in his time in Russia. However, he remained dependent on income from his lands. Throughout his life, Turgenev would create for himself a lasting international reputation as a great realist writer, which is essentially the sum of several literary reputations. There is a German and English Turgenev as well as French one, the one I study in my work. I do not discuss Turgenev's literary and editorial strategies in other countries. The literary and editorial strategies of Turgenev in France, his work with French publishers, Hachette, Edouard Dantu, Pierre-Jules Hetzel, and their links to his work in Russia are in the center of my attention. Marko Vovchok, Maria Vilinskaya-Markovich. Heroine of the third part of this work was from a family of poor landowners from the same region as Turgenev. Her father, Alexander Vilinsky, was an uneducated man who died earlier. Maria's stepfather, a man of cruel disposition, ruined the family's small estate. And the future writer, who witnessed serfdom, also knew deprivation throughout her childhood and adolescence. She grew up during the darkest years of the reign of Nicholas I, the time of severe censorship, war with Poland, broken ties with Europe, looming Crimean War. During her life, she changed her name several times. Her maiden name was Vilinskaya, surname Markovich, literary name Marko Vovchok, and finally a new surname Labach-Zhuchenko. She was married second time. Her rich biography can be split up into a few periods. Her childhood in Oryol, her nomadic life in Ukraine with her first husband, success in St. Petersburg, travels in Europe with Turgenev, studies in Heidelberg University and work in Paris, and then again, years in St. Petersburg, hard editorial and literary work followed by a long self-exile in Caucasus. A brilliant literary career, her own magazine of translated literature, and then total oblivion. Maria was brought up in a boarding school where she read French and English authors such as Anne Radcliffe, for example, who remained her favorite writer throughout her life. She finished her studies. After finishing her studies, she returned to her aunt's state, and by this time her extraordinary character became manifest. In the situation of poor parent without dowry, she looked after her nieces. Her only chance in life was to marry well, but she refused to get married to a rich landlord who, according to her autobiographical novel Живая душа and some biographical notes, was madly in love with her. Instead, suddenly she fell in love and married the Ukrainian folklorist Afanasy Markovich, a talented man without a sou, and left her aunt. Together with her husband, the future writer collected folklore. As Ivan Turgenev, she started her literary career both she started her literary career with a book of anti-serfdom short stories on popular Ukrainian life, written in Ukrainian and from the female point of view. They were published by Gogol's publisher in St. Petersburg, Pantelimon Kulish, under the male pseudonym Marko Vovchok, invented by Kulish on the model of George Sand. Her stories are about women serfs and women landlords. Marko Vovchok thus became the female voice of the anti-servage discourse. This narrative emerged thanks to a partial lifting of the level of censorship in the Russian Empire, which harshly oppressed under Nicholas I, the non-Russian speaking people. She joined the Ukrainian circle in St. Petersburg through Afanasy Markovich and met here poet Taras Shevchenko. This is how, Russian by birth, she ended up being considered and still considered today Ukrainian literary classic. The young and beautiful novelist knew success in St. Petersburg. Her manner was modest. She spoke very little, and Turgenev, already a famous writer who first met her at this time, compared her to a sphinx. Turgenev, this is a page showing the letter, Pantelimon Kulish's letter to Maria Markovich, where he proposed her this pseudonym, Marko Vovchok. Turgenev compared her to a sphinx. Turgenev, whose literary strategy was closely linked to the emancipation of serfs, fell for Markovich and wished to help her succeed in her career. Together with Kulish, he translated her stories, which he described as full of naive charm and poetic grace, into Russian. Thus, Marko Vovchok entered two literatures simultaneously, Ukrainian and Russian. Turgenev introduced her into Russian literary and intellectual circles and supported her financially. Her literary debut took place in the height of the peasant reforms in 1949. In 1948, state-owned peasants were granted personal freedom, and in 1861, a manifesto was issued granting freedom for those who belonged to private landowners. Thus, Marko Vovchok arrived at the time of social debate about personal and political liberties, which became a pivotal question in her writings. Turgenev also took her to Europe to escape an epidemic of cholera, where she completed her education in the University of Heidelberg, then in Paris, following his own academical footsteps. The name of Marko Vovchok appeared in the French press among literary news from Russia. At the same time, her husband Afanasy Markovich remained in St. Petersburg, and her departure weakened the novelist relationships with the Ukrainian community there. Turgenev entrusted Prosper Mérimée with Markovich's stories, which he translated himself, presenting them as a masterpiece of far superior to Uncle Tom, again Beecherstone. However, Mérimée, who became close to Turgenev at the time of the reforms, find them untranslatable, or rather unpublishable in French. He underlined the brutality that a French reader cannot accept, but he nevertheless gave practical advice for having them published in France, and even translated one story, Kazachka, which disappeared in the fire. Despite Mérimées' opinion, Markovich remained in Paris. She rented, thanks to Turgenev, a room in the pension where Harriet Beecher Stowe previously lodged, emphasizing their relationship. The novelist reproduced Turgenev's career by staying in France whilst continuing to be published in Russia. His stories did not appear in France and remained confined to the emigrant circle. French opinion was no longer interested in the emancipation of serfs in Russia. The number of Vovchok's work published in both languages is impressive, as well as her network, which included voices from the whole range of political opinion. She worked with Современник, with Русское слово, with Katkov and Русский вестник, with Евгений Корж in Санкт-Петербургские ведомости, with Основа, the Ukrainian Review, founded by Nikolai Kostomarov, Vasily Belozerский и Panteleimon Kulish. She published in a newly opened feminine language, feminine journal Подснежник, periodicals for young people with Vladimir Maykov, a women magazine entitled Lastочка, and in the review Рассвет, the scientific, literary, and artistic magazine for girls. It is extraordinary that she managed her career and maintained relationships with all these people from Paris, where she had moved together with her son Bogdan in 1861. Having no capital, having separated from her husband, and after refusing Turgenev's patronage, she lived in Paris exclusively on her literary income and was constantly looking for work. She was able to stay in Paris thanks to regular publication in Russia until the end of the liberal reforms in 1866. From the year 1863, living in France became difficult for her. The January uprising in 1863 in Poland against the Russian Empire put an end to the prosperous time, and the reforms turned into aggressive counteractions. All editions in Ukrainian were prohibited by a circular of Russian Minister of Interior Petr Valuev on July 30 July 1863. After July 63, she practically could not be published her Ukrainian writings at all. Most of the magazines were closed and Современник was suspended. So by the 1865, she had made an acquaintance of Pierre-Jules Hetzel, who also appears in the third part of my work and who launched her literary career in France. In the person of Hetzel, Markovich finds a long-term partner of her editorial strategy. Well, when Turgenev returned to Paris, bringing with him Maria Markovich, an old friend of Louis Verne, the publisher Pierre-Jules Hetzel also returned to Paris after 9 years of exile in Brussels. On August 13, 1859, the Moniteur, the main newspaper, main French imperialistic newspaper, published Napoleon III amnesty decree, which allowed all those convinced in 1848 and those exiled in 1851 to return to France. The victory in Crimea and the success of the Treaty of Paris in 1856 reinforced the prestige and power of the emperor. However, the Republican Party remained strong despite the absence of regular press organs, while at the same time, the Orleanist Party was losing momentum. Republicans insisted much more on liberty than on equality, liberty that did not threaten private property. Consequently, the new Republican ideas were gaining ground in the provinces, faithful support of the imperial regime from its beginning. Following the legislative elections of 1857, the regime of Napoleon III took a more liberal turn. Among the exiles was Hetzel, the former secretary of Lamartine, who had fled Paris after December the 2nd, like many Republicans. Among them were the author of his publishing house, Victor Hugo. Hetzel was born in the Chartres in 1814 in Chartres. He was the only child of a midwife and a soldier. He studied in the Collège Stanislas in Paris and then prepared to start studying law in Strasbourg. But either he failed his exams or the studies turned out to be too costly for his parents, and he gave up. He settled in Paris, where he found a job as a bookstore clerk. At that time, he led a very modest life. He rented a small room, but ended up finding a place for himself in the active and dynamic circles of the national newspaper, National. Everyone knew him in Paris, remembers Edward Grenier, his childhood friend, a big boy who gave an idea of beauty and elegance without being regularly handsome and really elegant in the ordinary sense of the word. Grenier remembers a walk with Hetzel from the Arsenal to the Faubourg Saint-Germain and described it thus. His dress was a little too personal and risked bordering on singularity. He affected, for example, to wear ties and a hat of an unusual shape. What trouble we had to cure him from that. He was then very keen on escaping worldly conventions. Yet he had too much taste and wit not to end up complying with them and dressing like everyone else. His face had nobility and delicacy at the same time. He wore his full bed, a pretty light bed of Venetian shade, and what framed him, which even better and finished giving him a character of youth and pride, was a forest of hair that he threw back. But his charm and his seduction were not there. They came rather from the moral, from the grace of his words, from the finesse of his insights, from the almost feminine delicacy of his feelings. He had known how to put heart into his mind, which is a rarity in Paris. And moreover, he brought into his conversation a certain courage to shake off prejudice, which gave his ideas a turn of agreeable paradox. Helpful, generous, always ready to pay for his person and his money, very ardent in politics, Republican by birth, friend of old Carbonari, he had his foot in several different worlds. Alexander Poulin's bookstore became his university because he knew no other, and very quickly the vocation of publisher made itself felt in him, who, citation, I quote, was not shy about imposing correction on everyone. Poulin and Hetzel founded a publishing house in 1837 and together launched the publication of La Comédie Humaine, Human Comedy by Balzac, illustrated by Doré. Then they published the scenes from private and public life of the animals, modeled on the La Fontaine's fables, a real bestseller of the time, but addressing the issues of contemporary society. Several authors, including Louis Viardot, contributed to it, publishing texts on different themes, each devoting his story to an aspect of contemporary life, each article being accompanied by illustrations. Hetzel obtained his first success with this book, with Scenes from Private Life, which he also made his beginning, where he also made his beginning of the writer under the pseudonym of Pierre-Jules Hetzel. Following years, he published a collection of journalistic short stories, Le Diable à Paris, with the help of the writers of the time. Hetzel presented this publication as a writer, journalist, and publisher, and even lent his features to the Mephisto on the cover, representing leaning over the map of Paris. However, luxurious editions gradually gave way to cheaper, more commercial books, and by the time of French Revolution of 1848, on the eve of the revolutionary events, Hetzel found himself almost ruined. Exile in Brussels, though it was as close as possible to Paris, was hard for him. Indeed, he had lost his publishing house, at the same time his political hopes, as well as certain friends and relatives. Despite these difficult circumstances, Hetzel maintained his relationship with authors and publishers all over Europe and in Paris. During the first year of his exile, he launched the collection of tiny books at 1 franc. This book formatted fit in the palm of the hand. responded to the challenges of the time by allowing clandestine editions of work banned in France to be produced. He published The Small Napoleon, a satirical work by Victor Hugo, of which he smuggled 6,000 copies into the capital of the French Empire. So this decree of August 59, the decree of Napoleon III, allowed Hetzel to reestablish his publishing house in France and restored his name to the cover of the books he published. With the financial support of his friends, in particular Alexander Bixio, the friend and partner of brothers Perrier, who founded Italian, Russian, and Spanish railways. Hetzel wasted no time. His other financial support with Camille Desprez, a wine merchant in Moscow. So he began to develop new markets and established relationships with new authors. During his exile in Brussels, Hetzel went from being a Parisian publisher focused on the Parisian market to becoming an international publisher. He established international contacts, for example, with Mavriky Wolf, ambitious publisher from St. Petersburg, and was interested in the issues of copyright, having suffered from Belgian contrefaçon. He also began to take interest in foreign authors. He bought the rights to the translation of Dvoryanskoye Gniezdo by Turgenev, probably even before having met the author. He met Turgenev through Louis Viardot and asked him to translate the tales of Charles Perrault, which he planned to sell to the St. Petersburg publisher Wolf. The fact that Hachette, partner of Hetzel, who at this time published Turgenev, and his friendship with the Viardots constituted the best possible recommendations. However, Hetzel was not interested in the political context of the success of the Russian novelist Turgenev. His interest was purely commercial. Hetzel's books were already present on the Russian market at this time, notably in the French book section at Wolf Library at Гостиный двор in St. Petersburg, but they were unauthorized translations, whilst Hetzel wanted to control his work abroad. Turgenev accepted Hetzel's proposal more out of politeness than out of real conviction. He had received his inheritance and now lived on the income of his lands. However, it was an important meeting for Turgenev because not only was Hetzel the publisher of George Sand and Victor Hugo, but also because long before, in 1843, Hetzel-Stahl had published the book Voyage où il vous plaira, путешествуйте куда хотите, travel whatever you want, story co-written with Alfred de Musset, whom Turgenev venerated. Turgenev signed his first contract with Hetzel at the start of 1862. This included Rudin, Turgenev's first novel, in which the eponymous character was killed on the Parisian barricades in 1848, a pivotal year in Hetzel's own life, as well as the short stories published during the previous year in France. This first contract with French publisher was drawn up by Hetzel on a simple piece of paper. This is Voyage où il vous plaira. Thanks to Hetzel, Turgenev started to publish his works in France without the intermediary of Louis Viardot. Well, Hetzel's recipes for Turgenev. A French writer. The publisher did not see Turgenev as an exotic foreign author. On the contrary, he tried to present him as a French writer. The terms of his contracts and the amount of 500 francs were quite common for the time. Thus, the first agreement signed by Hetzel and Jules Verne for the novel 5 Weeks in a Balloon was concluded according to the same model and the same year. However, the terms of the contract signed with Jules Verne will be changed later due to the significant increase in circulation, while the terms of the contract with Turgenev will never change. After signing with Hetzel, Turgenev ended his relations with other publishers, Hachette, whom he only knew through Viardot, and Dantu, whom he paid to be published. After breaking up with Markovich, after 4 years of friendship, Turgenev drew closer again to the Viardot couple, who were living at this point in Baden-Baden. The economic boom experienced by France during the Second Empire gave pride of place to operetta, which seduced Turgenev. With Pauline Viardot, Turgenev set up a series of operettas that interested him more than the literary project offered to him by Hetzel. Nevertheless, the latter waited patiently for Turgenev to respond and regularly suggested random translators for his works into French. Turgenev entrusted the management of his lands in Russia to his uncle, who tricked him, and he found himself almost ruined. Put in financial difficulty, Turgenev was forced to change his editorial strategy in France. He decided to publish his novel Smoke with Hetzel. Dym. On the injunction of publisher who urged him to adapt to the taste of the French reader, Turgenev was inspired for Smoke by Voyage où il vous plaira by Stahl, from which he borrowed the subject. The main character leaves his fiancée on the eve of the wedding to go on a voyage before finally returning to her. The first French translations was by Augustin Galitzin, editor of Catholic magazine. The overly cautious first version were retranslated by the chess master Valdemar Pagonkin, a translator found by Hetzel, and revised by Prosper Mérimée. Then the secretary of Hetzel's magazine of education and recreation, Ferdinand de Gramont, carried out the final reading. Turgenev actively participated in the work of his editor's team. According to Hetzel's editorial recipe, the writer's first book must be a success. In an advertising company financed by Hetzel, Nathan emphasized that Turgenev was a foreign author. Smoke was presented alongside new releases from Hetzel's collection for adults, including a book by Gustave Droz, Le Cahier Bleu, the blue blocknote. The first work of his author, Monsieur, Madame Bibet, was printed in more than 100,000 copies and was successful in the United States. His second work, Le Cahier Bleu, was reinforced his popularity and his popularity reached Russia. Hetzel wrote to the censorship committee in St. Petersburg to protect the book, while Maria Markovich, Marko Vovchok, and Dmitry Pisarev translated it for the Отечественные записки. Hetzel advised Turgenev to read the books of Droz and gave the latter the works of the Russian novelist as well. Thus, the authors of his library read each other. Despite careful preparation, Smoke did not achieve success, and only 9,000 copies were published in total. Hetzel and Turgenev had lost sight in the fact that Turgenev's very first book in France were the Sportsman's Sketches, and had not realized that his later books was inevitably be compared to it. Turgenev's reputation in France was already made, and critics noticed the change in the narrator's voice and lamented the loss of exotism. An attempt to adapt to the French model, the plot of social life in Baden, built around the attractive woman, all this replaced the wandering hunter and the sad Russian peasant. Turgenev was not accepted as a French writer. After Smoke, the collaboration between Turgenev and Hetzel became a personal rather than a commercial project, which meant that the sales of the book covered the published costs without advertisements in the newspapers. The next works by Turgenev passed unnoticed and attracted very little attention. In France, he only received a fixed remuneration for the translation of the Tales of Charles Perrault. He received from Hetzel the sum of 500 francs and the same sum for the rights to the volume of Frudin, while in Russia he received from Mikhail Katkov publisher of Русский Вестник, the equivalent of 16,000 francs, a very large sum for a novel in Russia, equal to the remuneration of Gustave Flaubert for sentimental education. This is, however, significantly less than Victor Hugo, who received 100,000 francs for Misérables, 200,000 francs for The Man Who Loves. Turgenev was disappointed. He compared himself to Dickens, who had no readers in France. This is a picture of Gustave Draws. Hetzel's strategy for Markovich, for Marko Vovchok in France, an exotic author for children. During the years before the Franco-Prussian War, Marko Vovchok sought to make her career in Paris without Turgenev's support. Despite her efforts, it was difficult for her to ensure her literary career in Russia whilst being abroad, and she had hardly any work left. She did not have the financial possibility to go often to Russia like Turgenev in order to maintain her editorial relations. Moreover, the time of reforms was coming to an end, and with a certain freedom of speech. The activity of the journals in which Markovich was regularly published, Современник, Русское слово, Основа, was suspended and closed. It is then that she came into contact with Hetzel, who for the part was looking for new authors for his new magazine of education and recreation, a magazine for young people, as well as reliable translators from French to Russian for the planned editions at Wolf in St. Petersburg. Turgenev did not participate in the meeting between his publisher and his former protege. Marko Vovchok gave the publisher the French translations, her own French translations of her stories, which had just been published under the title The Tales of Marko Vovchok, Сказки Marko Vovchoka, which contained the tales Haля, the bear and the slave, and which dealt with serfdom. Hetzel appreciated only one tale. This is a citation from translation from his letter to her, which Saltykov-Shchedrin found the weakest. It is obvious that Hetzel was aware of Marko Vovchok's reputation, or as he puts it, her rank in Russia. It is probable that Turgenev has spoken to her of her to Hetzel, just as to Mérimée, as of the Russian Beecher-Stowe. However, the emancipation of serfs in Russia was by now fait accompli, it was finished, that no longer mobilized public interest. Well, it was not finished, but it no longer mobilized, and which was therefore no longer an asset for Marko Vovchok. Hetzel began his collaboration with her in the same way as with Turgenev. He offered her to translate the works of authors of his publishing house and to publish her own writings. As he did with Turgenev, Turgenev required Markovich to adapt her text to the French public by renouncing scenes of violence and brutality to make them more educational. Markovich was an author for adults in Russian Empire, but Hetzel, who grasped the educational dimension of her text, sought to make her an author for young people. From 1865, following their meeting, Hetzel published her tales, which he edited himself, under the name of the nom de plume, distorted and unpronounceable of Marko Vovchok. It's here, you can see Marko Vovchok. Appeared in his reviews list of editors in the recreation section. The 6 tales of Markovich, edited by Hetzel, first appeared in this magazine, then in volume, in the series of Library of Education and Recreation, and always under the double signature of Stahl and Marko Vovchok. But this name, Marko Vovchok, like Stahl, only appeared in Hetzel bookshop and on the pages of his magazine. The Russian and Ukrainian inspiration of Hetzel. Thanks to Turgenev, and Markovich, Hetzel-Stahl took a close interest in Ukraine and Russia and designed 2 books devoted to these countries. Michel Strogoff by Jules Verne, a novel that described Russia under Nicholas I, and Marusia, his adaptation of Markovich's novel dealing with a popular Ukrainian subject. And these were 2 very different books. The Exiled Fedor's Last Dream. Indeed, it turned out that Hetzel did not only compose moralizing tales for young children. In reality, he wrote stories in his tiny notebooks, such as Fedor Exilé, the Fedor Exile, supposedly dated 1972, in the time where he was very close with Markovich, a perfectly romantic text that he would never seek to publish under his name, which put his own experience of exile into the exotic winter setting which he discovered during his visits to St. Petersburg to meet Markovich and Wolf. His friends, so I translate the beginning. His friends, his relatives, all those whom his disgrace had not put to flight, wanted to see him before he left once again. It was 7 o'clock in the morning. The cold was excessive. The snow had covered the ground for 52 days. St. Petersburg seemed to be buried under the shroud of ermine. The sleigh, which was to carry Fyodor, was waiting on the door of the hotel, and the steward saw to it that was nothing missing in the final preparation. He was still sleeping. The hour, however, was approaching. His friend Alexandrov decided to wake him. Alas, said Fyodor, opening his eyes, I slept peacefully, I dreamed peacefully. Oh, Alexandrov, why did you wake me up? You were not dreaming, said a beautiful and noble young woman who had followed in the footsteps of Alexandrov. I am living with you. Our magnanimous emperor had consented to exile with you. Siberia is Siberia, but exile is no longer alone. The Petersburg newspapers recently announced that the young countess, widow of the general, had obtained permission to become the wife of the exiled Fyodor. The hero of this novel, of this little story, becomes a secondary character in Jules Verne's novel Michel Strogoff, a novel about the long Siberian journey of a devoted royal courier. Hetzel planned that Markovich would translate Michel Strogoff into Russian, but she informed him that the novel was banned by the censorship. There is, however, no documentary evidence of such a ban. On the contrary, the book was allowed in Russia. Markovich almost certainly did not wish to translate a novel to the glory of Imperial Russia. Soon after, their collaboration ended. Marusia, the return of political context. The only work by Markovich that Hetzel really appreciated was Marusia, the little girl Marusia, the novel Marusia. The little girl Marusia who gives her life for the independence of her country in the late 17th century Cossack wars between Getman Bruchavetsky on the Moscow side and Getman Doroshenko on the side of Poland and Turkey. And this story was for Hetzel a sort of, and this girl was for Hetzel a sort of Ukrainian Joan of Arc. Marko Vovchok's story presented the conflict through the eyes of a child without any details, so her novel passed for censorship control. Hetzel saw in the story parallels with his native Alsace, invaded at the time by the Prussians. He had his adaptations of Markovich's own translation into French, put it in historical and political context. He published his translation under his pseudonym Stahl, which he used for his own works, and when he considered that his participation in the writing of the text justified it, or that the name of the real author did not sell enough. This is how he presented female authors. At the same time as Marusia, he adapted an American bestseller, Hans Brinker or the Silver Skates, a story of life in Holland by Mary Mapes Dodge, without citing her name on the cover. The tension between Hetzel and Turgenev intensified after the success of Marusia, when Hetzel was awarded a prize from the French Academy. This happened during the Literary Congress in Paris in 1878. The Congress dedicated to the copyright. Turgenev accused his friend of plagiarism in personal letters and probably in the newspapers too, where he demanded that Hetzel put Markovich's name next to his own pseudonym Stahl. Turgenev insisted that the publisher adopted the spelling of Markovich's name to the French reader instead of name Marko Vovchok, just as unpronounceable for Russians as for French. It was not until a few years later, a month after Turgenev's death, that Hetzel changed his strategy towards Markovich and once again offered to publish her in France under the name she preferred. As for translation of the French version of Marusia into Russian, which Hetzel offered to Markovich, that became absolutely impossible because the censorship prohibited its entry into Russian territory by pointing out its strong pro-Ukrainian and anti-Russian bias. Marusia by Stahl was banned in Russia, and Michel Strogoff could not find a translator. The fear of censorship was too great. This marked the end of Hetzel's editorial activity in Russia.
Thank you, Polina, for this extremely informative talk. Kirill Zubkov, the discussant. Kirill.
Yes, thank you, Polina. That's really an important talk, and that raises a lot of questions that we probably have to think about. So what was probably the most interesting thing for me in your talk was your description of this complicated web of relations between different authors, editors, their readers, and so on. What I like about this is this international approach, so to say, in the sense that you don't focus on a national tradition, and you don't describe like the intersection of different national traditions as either. You rather pay attention to this international market that international literary market that existed at the time, and that was not actually determined by the borders of the states or the borders of national literary traditions and so on. This market, as you demonstrate, shaped the reputations of writers and it tremendously influenced their creative output and how this output was perceived in different parts of the world. I believe it's important in a sense that while we actually have a lot of scholarship about how different literary traditions and different authors engage capitalism, engage market, those works usually focus on domestic market, and they usually pay attention to just well, for example, we have a lot to just domestic processes. For example, we have very important book by Vadim Schneider, which I actually like a lot. That's mostly about Russian literature and capitalism. It's called Capitalist Realism. But this book actually focuses on only on Russian capitalism and not on this international market. So I believe this to be extremely important. That to draw attention to this international market relations, and I think that when we consider those relations, it really highlights completely different aspects of literary evolution, and how it was, and it allows us to draw a really a perspective that is not bound by those traditional historiographies that are that basically put it draw that are basically focused and built around national traditions. So I think that's extremely important. And I would like to just if I have several more minutes, I would like to pay attention to one episode that is, I believe, important, and that's related to Turgenev, France, international market, and a lot of other problems. This is Turgenev's participation in the conference on intellectual property that took place in Paris in 1878, in 1878, and where Turgenev famously, at the same time, Turgenev tried to highlight the importance of translations of cultural contexts and the depth of actually Russian writers to French writers. But at the same time, he also wanted to actually he actually wanted the basically, Turgenev wanted the copyright to remain much more lax and much less strict than the French organizers of the conference probably wanted. And in Turgenev's opinion, this so to say protectionism was actually needed for the literatures that, as Turgenev seemed to believe, were still lagging behind the French literature, in the sense that in the situation of inequality between literary traditions, of course, the introduction of strict copyright laws would actually favor French literature. As the one that was more rich, both literary rich in the sense of the amount of money, and symbolically rich in the sense of its international authority and respect. So yeah, and this and as far as I know, Turgenev's speech was actually criticized, and it was both in France and in Russia. And in Russia, it actually was believed, interestingly enough, that Turgenev betrayed Russian literature because he admitted French priority. I actually started looking into this episode because of Ivan Goncharov's reaction to this whole situation. Goncharov was, as everybody probably knows, consumed by deep paranoid feelings towards Turgenev, and he believed that Turgenev was stealing his works. So Goncharov actually believed that the purpose of whole conference was to continue stealing his works and to somehow hide the fact that a lot of French literature, as Goncharov believed, borrowed his ideas. But so we might think that it was just a ridiculous episode of writer's insanity. But if we look at the newspapers that were published in the Russian Empire, we will see that their authors were writing almost the same thing, without, of course, stealing Goncharov's ideas, but it was mostly the same thing, and that actually natural school preceded French naturalism. They were literally publishing articles about that, and that actually French writers wanted to somehow create create an equal situation on international market that would favor them, and so on and so on. You could see a lot of such things. So yeah, so I think so. Yeah, and I believe this episode actually shows that a lot of a lot of problems and a lot of categories that we usually consider as isolated and autonomous in the literary field, such as the figure of author and the author's rights, and the author's literary property, were actually shaped by the forces of international book market that was already active at the time that we are speaking about. And so if you could comment on that, and if you could please tell us something that you probably know about this situation with the conference from French side, about which I actually don't know enough, I would be grateful. So thank you, Polina.
Thank you, Kirill, for very inspiring comments. Yes, for me, it's an interesting point of view, the point of view of international capitalism, and this vocabulary I do not use, but it's interesting. So I will have a look. I will. I ask you later for this book you cited concerning the Congress in the 78. It was the first Congress of the authors, right? And the property, intellectual property, took place in Brussels in 1859. And Hetzel, who lived at this time in Brussels, and who was in the center of the publishing life, he participated actively in this first Congress. He even wrote a book about how we should organize, how we should recognize the intellectual property. And he proposed that author should keep his intellectual all these rights 70 years after his death. It was absolutely new thing for the time, because in the late 50s, the intellectual property was questioned by Proudhon, by Louis, by Leblanc. It was questioned if this already exists as a property, or probably the society owns everything because society gives the value. It was this discussion between intellectuals. And by the time to the time of this Congress in Paris, which was of course very important, the answer was already founded. Yes, of course, the intellectual property exists. Author has his moral and all his rights, but translators, it was again the translators who left in this like in the shadows. So that there was no rights for translators, and that was the point of Turgenev's speech. He asked for the international rights for translators, and at that moment he thought about the young nihilists, young girls and boys, students who lived from these translations, and they were very, very low paid, and there were no rights for their work. For just to show a long story short, Turgenev's ideas was not accepted. Were not accepted at this time. He was mocked by some French journalists who said, what do we want that we paid for your nihilists there? And no, it was not accepted by this time. But Berne Convention, the last one, probably again the most important one, which took place 10 years later, fixed all these international disproportions. So this Congress in Paris was like the last step to the real regulation of authors' rights and copyright in Europe.
Great, thank you, Polina and Kirill. Hilda Hugenbaum, please. Please.
Good morning, Ilya. So, Polina, I want to commend you. I think this is extraordinary work, and for all the reasons that Kirill has enlisted, and I'm so happy to see Kirill here. And I think this is very much the direction, you know, that my work is in, and the international side, and especially the importance of translations. It's so clear that certainly the Russians understood exactly how important this was for them. You know, we continue to see how important this is for Russian literature today. So I think this is utterly fascinating. And so I look forward to reading all your work. And I don't have any questions because there is so much that I'm just absorbing from all the angles that you've presented. And so thank you so much. I think it's so important to have these kind of nodes where men and women writers are both kind of working the business and figuring out kind of how all the pieces fit together, and the personas that they create. And I thought you did such a marvelous job of showing what that the French were looking for something in Russian literature that was rather different than what the Russian market was interested in. And so I look forward to everything that you publish. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's really important for me to hear something like that. Thank you.
I see another question from Marta. I will unmute you.
Yes, it's not also, it isn't a question. It's rather a commentary connected with the, let's say, Polish trait, because when you presented the way the surname of Marko Vovchok was written in the French journal, and you were told that it was impossible to read. In fact, as far as I noticed, it was in Polish transcription. I will write it down in the chat that if I was able to see it clearly. But it's very interesting that this Polish way of writing down her surname and this issue of interconnections between Russia, Ukraine, and Poland. Yes, because I looked in the internet that in the 20s and 30s of the 20th century, Marko Vovchok was published in Poland. I mean, in Poland, in Lviv, and in the then Polish part of the Ukraine. So it's interesting.
I understand. Yes, I understand. Yeah.
Yes, these intersections between different literatures, different countries, and I will write down the way of transcription. It struck me that it was Polish transcription of her surname.
It's very interesting. It's very interesting because and I forgot to mention that she was close to the Polish circles in St. Petersburg, and because Mavriky Wolf was close, Nikolai Leskov, Afanasy Markovich, Kulish. So there was and she was close to the Polish. She knew Polish. And in Paris, she also met yes, Vovchok, yeah, like that, and Marko.
No, the Marko isn't Polish, but Vovchok, yes, it's exactly the Polish transcription.
Yeah, thank you. It's interesting and it's important. It's very important. Well,
I'm happy that I helped.
I see
Thank you, Marta.
Valeria Sobol. I will unmute you.
Thank you. I would also like to thank Polina for such fascinating, rich work. And I must confess, even though I work on Russian-Ukrainian connections, but not exclusively, and I grew up in Ukraine and we read Marko Vovchok as part of the curriculum, you know, in school, a part of the Ukrainian literature, required curriculum. We only read Institutka, and that kind of was the limit of my exposure. Then I knew about the Jewish story about Pisarev drowning when being with her, but I wasn't aware of that complex other connections. It's fascinating. And yeah, I'm very grateful for doing this work, especially now. I had a question about Marusia, and so it seemed like there was some kind of romanticization of Cossacks. To what extent it fit into the previous French tradition of portraying or perceiving Ukrainian Cossacks in a sort of perhaps romanticizing way, because there's also tradition started, at least by Voltaire, of presenting them in kind of unruly, barbaric force. And according to some scholars, these two traditions competed in like further literary sort of imaginary about Cossacks. So I don't know if you've looked at that, but like basically my question is if there was already some kind of tradition in French literature or historiography of portraying Ukrainian Cossacks, and how that work fit into that or did not.
Thank you, Valeria. First, I will say something about Pisarev and his drawing. The novel they translated together of Gustav Droz it was translated like the golden days of the young French lady. And it ended by the drawing of this poor lady into the river. And the last chapter of this novel, translated by Pisarev, was published in Отечественные записки together with the news about his drowning in the Baltic Sea. And when I found it, I was so impressed. It's well a coincidence or not. We never find out, but still, literature, art imitates life, imitates art. But about Cossacks, it's as I know. In my study, that was Prosper Mérimée who were interested in Cossacks, and he even translated Kazachka, the story of Marko Vovchok, into French, but it was lost because all his papers were buried in his house, and unfortunately this translation was lost. But still, and he also published a couple of articles about the Cossacks. So he tried to find out in his these Eastern European studies, So it was Prosper Mérimée, and Hetzel, he asked Marko Vovchok about the details in the letters. Well, when he made his adaptation, so he knew practically nothing himself. It was difficult for him to pronounce the Slavic names from the very beginning to the very end. He made an effort in the letters to Turgenev and to Markovich, but still, so he was not this historian, and his text is addressed to children, where he tried to explain what's going on in this time and this place, according to the historical facts. While the Marko Vovchok's Marusia novel is very vague. It's for children and it's very poetic, and it has nothing with the plain explanation. That's why the Hetzel's Marusia was prohibited immediately by the Russian censorship, because they read it clearly what's going on. And that's what I can say for now.
Thank you. Any other questions? Does anyone have any follow-up questions? In this case, may I ask a question? I will call on myself. So actually, a couple of questions. One is a very quick one, which is, how useful do you find, Polina, in your research, the model that is so famously sketched out for us, the model of world literary market that is so famously sketched for us by Pascal Casanova? One question. And then the second question would be whether or not we know of a number of cases where the texts were actually, the translated texts in French were actually amended. There were additions were made to the Russian texts. Famously, Turgenev adds an epilogue to the translation of First Love, and so on. Have you looked at, is there a kind of logic behind what is added and what is excluded as the texts get move from the Russian to the French context?
Thank you, Ilya. First question, frankly speaking, I don't know. For me, it's something absolutely new. Please give me the references. I would happy to discover. For me, it's, well, I live in the forest and the stone. No, I'm joking. Second question is, well, concerning the First Love and the edition made by Louis Verdot. He didn't like the story. He thought it's a story of Ham, from the biblical Ham. And all the corrections which were made by Hetzel, proposed by Verdot, they touched this brutality and what we can say, which we can explain like savagery, so savage morals. So it was like not adapt, but just to avoid the morals which are and the acts which can be too brutal for the French to the French reader. It was not only because of like foreign texts, like Russian texts, but also if you compare Gustave Droz, he was compared with Crébillon Fils, the author of like very grievous author of 18th century, which were very open, like of course everyone read Marquis de Sade. Everyone read Marquis de Sade, and this Second Empire morals were very, very strict, and at the same time with the prohibited and closed literature. So everything, so the censorship in France was the censorship of some erotics and open sexuality moments in novels. That was like that. So Gustave Droz was like Crébillon Fils censored by this. Even this the Second Empire was very very joyful place, you may say like that. But literature must be didactical. It's also the idea of literature as, first of all, the educational instrument, which was still active in the time when Turgenev published himself in France. And Marko Vovchok, of course, her novels, she published them without Hetzel. So she published Лихой человек, as it was translated as a fatal love, amour fatal. But it's about sexual obsession. So it was possible, but still, okay. I hope I answered.
Yeah, thank you. That was super helpful. Does anyone? I mean, it's quite funny in that epilogue where he ends up adding something in the epilogue that could not be said in Russia, and at the same time attempting to ward off the sort of thing that a French reader might object to, namely the whole introduction of the problematics of morality, right? On the one hand, and on the other hand, saying something like something is rotten in the kingdom of Denmark, and this is a specifically Russian problem, right? Is something that I think would be tricky in the Russian context. Anyway, just a follow-up on what you said. Does anyone else have any questions? Okay, wonderful. We're just on time. So thank you so much, Polina and Kirill. This was really, truly super informative and thought-provoking. Yeah, and Polina, I will send you the reference.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, see you soon.